Hi kids, it's time for some history. All right. Okay, the unit you guys are doing is early American government, how our country was formed. I'm going to break this out. I'm going to do one lecture on these topics, and then I'll talk about our branches of government and the Bill of Rights in the next one. That should get you through the first 4 or 5 lessons in our unit. And this is its unit. Let me look. I got the book here. We are on Unit 10, Chapter 10. And today I'm going to talk about Lesson 1 and 2. And the forming of our government. Okay, so we went to war. We separated. We had our Declaration of Independence from England. Well, we needed a government to run. And we did not have the government we have today. We had what was called the Articles of Confederation. This was the earliest form of government that we had between being run by England and forming what is today the United States and our Constitution. Now, the Articles of Confederation lasted for a lot. I don't have the dates. I gotta look those. This would be something for you guys to look. 2 things for you guys to look up and put in the comments on Google Classroom. How many years do we have the Articles of Confederation? And, I had this challenge for my class. How many presidents were there? There were quite a few before George Washington and our modern Constitution. So look those up and let me know. So real quick, the Articles of Confederation were our first form of government, but they were very flawed, so they didn't end up working too well. They got us through the war and a few years afterwards, but they needed to be replaced. Some of the things that were different about the Articles of Confederation is that there was no executive or judicial branch, and we're going to talk about that, the 3 branches of government that we have today. There weren't 3 branches of government. There was just the legislative, and it was very hard to get anything done. The federal government or the central government didn't have the power to tax, so they couldn't raise money. After a war, wars cost money. The governments, the Americas, owed France and Spain and other countries lots of money because we borrowed to fight the war. And they had no way of paying it back because they couldn't raise taxes. But the individual colonies, or at that point states, could raise taxes, but they didn't have to pay federal tax. And if you don't have to pay tax, a lot of people don't pay tax if you don't have to. I don't see Apple volunteering to pay tax, or Google, or a lot of these other companies, because they don't have to pay taxes. They have loopholes that they get through, and so the states were doing the same thing. This caused a lot of problems. There was no centralized government, and they could have changed it, but they needed 100% to change. So everybody in the legislative branch had to vote yes to change the Articles of Convention or Articles of Confederation. So they didn't work, and they caused a lot of problems. One problem was that the states were taxing, certain states were taxing pretty heavily, and that caused a rebellion, and it was called Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion was a rebellion against the heavy taxation in states. And there was no way for the federal government to respond to it because there wasn't a centralized government then. So, people started to argue, like, this isn't working. Our form of government isn't working, so we need to do something about it. So what did they do? They had a constitutional convention. So they decided to just scrap this, get rid of the Articles of Confederation, and start a different form of government. And this was a hot debate. Think about it. People have different opinions. So they came together, and it took months of debate and argument, and people wanted different things. Under the Articles of Confederation, in the legislative branch, which was the only branch of government, every state had 1 vote. Well, this worked well for states with small populations, but it didn't work well for states with large populations. So people argued that. So we ended up having a lot of debate and compromise. Not everybody got what they wanted. And the two main compromises that I want you guys to understand, one we'll talk about is it's all about the legislative branch and how we have a Congress. In our Congress, we have House of Representatives and we have a Senate. Now, we're going to talk about that in a second, why we have two branches of legislation. Okay? And then we'll talk about slavery and what the compromise on slavery was. So let's go back to the compromise on the legislative branch. Now, they're forming this new form of government. They realize they need an executive branch, so they give the executive branch powers. Right now, our executive branch has many powers from our Constitution. One is it's the head of the military. So you can look at our three branches of government, our executive, legislative, and judicial. And we'll get more into this in the next lesson. But for now, just understand there's three branches of government. We've covered it several times in class. So the three branches of government, we're going to talk about the compromises in writing the Constitution. And one of the compromises was when building, who's going to represent, who's going to make the laws, because that's who the legislative branch, they make the laws. So some states said, well, every state should have a representative, every state should have equal representatives. Other states said, no, it should be based on population. Like New York, we have a lot of people. It's not fair that a state like Virginia has just as much vote as us because we represent more people. Well, this went back and forth. Should it be the representation by the amount of people, or should it be by state? So it went back and forth, back and forth. Finally, they made a compromise. And what they ended up doing is splitting the Congress into two branches. And so we have the House of Representatives today, which is by the number of people in a state. So California has 300, I don't know, look at another thing to look up, but has several hundred, not several, has several, like I think 50, I don't know, look it up, how many people. But we have a lot of representatives in Congress. And where a state like South Dakota only has one or two. So in the House of Representatives, states like California have more representation because it's based on population. And then we have the branch, the Senate, which is every state has two senators. Every state has two senators. So that's why, right now we can look at population-wise, if we look at Congress, the Democrats own the House because by population, more people vote Democratic. Now, by state, the Senate is Republican because more states are Republican. This is how our government works. It's a balance. Now, some people would argue that it's outdated and that we need to change that because population is no longer as rural as it used to be, which rural means living in the country, farming. A lot more people are living in the cities, and those cities tend to be less represented in Senate because of the way voting areas are determined. Okay, so that's the compromise. That was a compromise. They decided to do both instead of one or the other. Now, the other compromise was about slavery. They did argue, some people argued at the time that slavery was outdated and immoral and should be ended. Some people argued that they needed slavery for their economy and that it was the natural order of things. These arguments went back and forth and they had a compromise. And basically it was, what ended up leading to the American Civil War, which was certain states were slaveholding and certain states weren't. And that they pretty much drew a line that said, these states on this side are going to be slave, these states on this side aren't going to be. So those are the two big compromises in our Constitution. So read up on them. That's lesson 1, lesson 2. And if you have any questions, you can ask me in small group or when we have our class meetings. Now, I'll make another video probably a little later in the week about 3 branches of government. I want to do a little research. And the Bill of Rights. All right? You guys have a good one. Good day. Oh, my wig fell off. All right. Bye.